Everyone. So welcome. We're so glad to have you here. Hopefully you all weren't in as much rain as I was today, but now hopefully you're somewhere nice and cozy to get started to learning about community land trusts. So as people continue to join, I'm just going to do a little introduction and then we will get started. Thank you all for being here today. And if I look away from you, it's just because I'm looking at my second screen, so know that. So we're here today. We're so excited that Will's joining us, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about village preservation. I know a lot of people who come to these know us well, but for those who don't, we are an organization that was founded about 20 years ago, and we serve Greenwich Village, the West Village, and NoHo, and we're to preserve our history and our buildings, and I'll talk about that in a second. And we also do events like this. So we have over 75 events we do for free across different topics. And so you'll see here, there's information about how to donate. You can find out more about us on our website here that I'm putting in the chat. We have some exciting events coming up. We actually premiered our in-person events. We're coming back in person. So we were at the Salmagundi Club this week. We were at the New York Studio School, and we'll be unveiling a plaque to recognize the sip-in at Julius's Bar later this month. So we hope you'll join us for that. And then of course we have our wonderful virtual panels coming up like today. And then the other thing that I think is relevant for me to share today is our advocacy work that we do around zoning, around making our space livable. And our recent success today, if you get our emails, you heard from Andrew Berman, our executive director, that the governor's proposal to eliminate the FAR kind of floor area ratio situation that was defeated, it wasn't included in the budget, so that's a big win. But the reason I show you this is because we make it very easy to participate in our advocacy. So you can see here, there's just a button you click and you can very easily contact your electeds for the relevant campaign that we have. So we hope you will take a look at that as well as our website. Consider becoming a member. We are a nonprofit organization, and membership is one thing that drives our work. So there are many membership levels that you can check out if you're interested in, and you can always donate if you have a few bucks to join the fight. We appreciate it, and it helps us keep these programs free, which is rare. I've been very lucky in my career to do a lot of free programming. As I might have not mentioned, my name is Leanne Bowley. I'm the director of programming at Village Preservation, started in February, and I've been meeting some of our great community members since. So with that said, I'm going to turn things over to Will, who joined the New Economy Project in February, but in 2021, and is a lifelong New Yorker from Queens, which I love. I'm a Queens person, and is committed to fighting for economic justice and an equitable city. For over a decade, Will has worked as an organizer and advocate with immigrant communities and working class communities. Before joining the New Economy Project, he was the project director at CHIA, which is a great organization here in Queens, where he expanded tenant organizing and foreclosure prevention, which is something we're really talking about right now in all of our communities. Organized small businesses to fight commercial displacement, also something we work to do at Village Preservation. And at the New Economy Project, Will supports key campaigns, including the Community Land Trust campaign, which we'll learn about today, public bank campaigns. And also, I don't know if you've seen, Will, if you watch Billions, there's been a lot of talk about the land banks on Billions. So it's starting to get into the ether that more people are thinking about this. He holds a master's degree in international political economy and development from Fordham University and a bachelor's degree from Queens College. We will have this wonderful presentation for Will. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. I'll also be looking at the chat. I will turn off my screen, but I'll still be here. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A pane, and Will, take it away. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
All right, thank you so much for the invitation. Really glad to join you on this rainy and stormy evening. So I'm going to share my screen and get right into it. As we mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A feature, and I'm happy to answer them towards the end. So really happy to be here. My name, as was mentioned, is Will Spizak. I'm Senior Program Associate with New Economy Project, and I get to work on community land trusts with so many groups around the city doing tremendous work. So I'm here representing New Economy Project, but also speaking on behalf of the New York City Community Land Initiative, which is a coalition of organizations around the city that are either forming community land trusts or advocating for community land trusts. So I'll speak a little bit more about some of the amazing work that's happening in different neighborhoods. But yeah, just to get into it a little bit, let me talk about my organization. So New Economy Project is a citywide organization that works with community groups throughout the city, mostly in lower income, Black, Brown, immigrant neighborhoods that are working to build new economic systems, new economic institutions that work for all New Yorkers, that are based on principles of cooperation, equity, social and racial justice, ecological sustainability. So this mission has led us into a number of different campaigns, from fighting against predatory lending and foreclosure crisis to advocating for the creation of a public bank in New York City, to fighting for community land trusts or institutions. We'll talk a little bit more, but organizations that work to take land out of the speculative market, make sure that our neighborhoods stay accessible and affordable for our communities in perpetuity. So just to kind of frame a little bit about the problem, which I think everyone who's joining is probably familiar with already, but we always want to just kind of ground ourselves in what's at stake, right, when we're talking about our neighborhoods and we're talking about ownership and stewardship of land. We know in New York City and probably every urban area in the country at this point is facing a crisis. We have an affordable housing crisis. We have affordable commercial space crisis, right? Our small businesses are disappearing. Our cultural institutions are disappearing, and everything is being replaced by luxury condos, big box stores, and the like. And the root cause of this, pun intended, root cause, comes back to the land, right? Ultimately, land is a commodity in this country. It's seen as an investment vehicle for real estate developers, for Wall Street. So when we think about our neighborhoods, we think about our neighbors, we think about the businesses and the institutions that make it a special place. But for real estate developers, for Wall Street investors, all they see is another commodity to buy, sell, and trade. So we see New York City's future being fought over between, on the one hand, those that see land as a profit-making tool, as a commodity to be bought and sold, versus those of us that recognize land as essentially a public good, right? Regardless of whose name is on the deed, the land underneath our feet is a public good that needs to be treated as such. So the Community Land Trust is an idea to create an alternative to the current status quo, and the Community Land Trust is a tool to do that. So it's not a panacea; it doesn't always solve every problem, but it is a tool that we can use to take land off the speculative market and to ensure that it's used to develop housing or other spaces that remain inclusive and affordable in perpetuity, right, forever, and make sure that it never becomes a tradable commodity again. So before diving into the specifics of how CLTs work and what they look like, I always like to start with a land acknowledgement, something that New Economy Project and nicely our coalition takes very seriously, because we recognize that when we talk about land as a commodity, we're talking about a cultural norm that was established, through settler colonialism, and we recognize that we are having this conversation about land stewardship and ownership on what is essentially stolen land. So we want to recognize that fact, and also recognize the fact that a lot of what we're talking about in terms of decommodifying land and treating it as a public good and recognizing our responsibility to steward that land is really drawing on traditions that come from indigenous communities. And we're just in the process of relearning those ideas that had been erased due to the violent oppression of those people. So we recognize that we're on Lenni Lenape land. I'm actually coming to you from Matinacock land out in Queens. So always want to make sure we're grounding ourselves in that reality. So back to the CLTs. How do CLTs work, right? This is the first question that we always get. It sounds like a cool tool, but how do you use it? So the idea of a community land trust is that it is a nonprofit organization with the mission to acquire and permanently steward land and make sure that any land that's developed, any building or use that's developed on top of that land remains, again, affordable and accessible, inclusive, and reflects the needs of the community. How do we do that? So community land trusts have some important features that make them unique. One is, that they're democratically governed, and usually by what we call a tripartite or three-part board. So this is a unique feature of community land trust, and we have this little image over to the side that kind of represents the three buckets or the three parts that usually make up the governing body of a community land trust. And every CLT is different. Every CLT, has maybe a different qualifications for who can become board members or who become members of the general body or might have a steering committee. But this, just to clarify, is very kind of high level, very basic model of the CLT. So usually on a community land trust board, you'll have three groups. You'll have the residents or direct users of the community land trust. So if your CLT is supporting housing, the tenants or homeowners will have representation on the board. If the CLT is for another purpose, and I'll get into that in a little bit, you might have the businesses or the farmers or whoever might be using the CLT as a member of the board. In addition to those who directly live on or use the land, there's also another group of people who become members of the community land trust and become members of the governing board. And those are members of the surrounding community. And that's a really important part of the community land trust, is that people who are affected by what happens on a parcel of land, even if you're not the one directly living on it or using it, you have a say also in governing that that land, right? Because we recognize that land is a public good. So even if I'm not necessarily the one living or utilizing on a daily basis a parcel of land, what happens there will impact my life as a member of the community, as a member of the neighborhood. So we think, in the CLT movement, that it's really important that you have other community members involved. And this could be anyone really involved in the neighborhood. We've been, really lucky to be working with folks at Picture the Homeless, an organization that really helped us start the New York City Community Land Initiative, and recognizing that even people who are completely robbed of power in the community could be involved in a community land trust, like folks who are experiencing homelessness, or tenants who might not have any direct say in the governance of their own body, of their own building, but live next to the community land trust. They could be members of the CLT. So there's so many opportunities to connect people who otherwise couldn't be involved in stewarding land directly to the CLT. And then the third bucket of people who are often involved in the governing of the community land trust are, kind of what we might call like the professional group, the technocrats, if you will. They usually might be public officials or experts in housing or building management, and they're often there to help advise and provide that technical assistance that community members might need. Right? Not everyone knows how to fix a boiler or something like that. So it's always good to have folks who are, some experts about that on the board, who understand housing finance, who understand some of the technical aspects of governing a group like a CLT and stewarding that land. The second feature that we want to highlight is the flexibility, right? So CLTs are a flexible and proven model, and we'll talk about a number of the examples that we want to highlight. But the idea of a community land trust, we might think of it in New York right now. A lot of the conversations about CLTs has to do with affordable housing, and it is a amazing tool to support affordable housing, but it's really remarkably flexible. So in regards to housing, CLTs can support rental housing, they can support home ownership, they can support limited equity or shared equity home ownership models. So there's really no limit in the kind of arrangements that you can have with a CLT. CLTs also support other things, right? We have examples of community land trusts that are organizing to support small businesses, to make sure that small businesses have access to affordable rents that can keep them in the neighborhood. CLTs that support community space, like community centers, that also experience gentrification and get pushed out of neighborhoods when land becomes a hot commodity. The original community land trust in the United States, which started in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, was actually a group of Black farmers that organized to get access to good land so that they can make a living as farmers. So the CLT model has evolved from rural to urban environments, and in that process has taken on many different forms, but it's been an extremely flexible model, which is a benefit of using the CLT. And I should mention that you can support multiple purposes. You can have commercial spaces, community space, housing, community gardens, etc. The third feature I want to highlight is the separation of ownership between the land and the buildings that sit on the land. So the nonprofit entity that is the community land trust owns the land underneath the housing, and they will hold that land forever. That is the purpose of the trust, is to always steward the land. What the CLT does is then they issue a 99-year renewable lease for the buildings that sit on top of the land. And in that lease, there are often, prescriptions about what you can do with that building as, the stewards of the land. So for instance, a community land trust might issue a 99-year lease to a mutual housing association, and that mutual housing association will be responsible for governing the building and making sure that rents stay affordable and are serving the needs of the community. And the mutual housing association will have a ongoing relationship with the community land trust, but they'll remain two separate entities. This is why also the model works for home ownership models, right? So you can have a CLT with single family homes, right, that are built on the land. The homeowner doesn't own the land, but they own the structure on top of it, and they can actually build equity in the improvements of the home. So they're not building, wealth off of speculating on the land, but they are able to build some individual wealth through the management of the building that sits on top of it. And that's why it also works with co-ops and shared equity co-ops and things of that nature. You could be a shareholder in a building, while still not owning the land. The community land trust will own the land. So again, there could be multiple layers of democratic governance, right? You can have a CLT with a democratically governed mutual housing association or co-op on top of it. And there are many ways to involve tenants and residents in the governance of and stewardship of the land. And then the last part, speaking to that, is that CLTs involve ongoing community organizing and partnerships, and that ensures their long-term success. So CLTs are not something that you organize for, you get, and then you're done. The CLT needs to always be organizing the community, both the residents who are living on it or the people who are using it, as well as the members of the surrounding community. It's really, in that sense, it thrives on democratic participation of community members, and as such depends on members of that CLT continuously engaging and organizing members of the community. So you might ask, how do CLTs get land, right? We're in New York after all, and getting land is very difficult. We have a little cartoon here. How do we get land? You might ask. There are 4 main strategies to do that. So we'll talk a little bit about different CLTs that have used different approaches. But the first way that CLTs typically get land is they could pressure their government to give public property to CLTs. So, we're probably pretty familiar with this process in New York City. We've seen the city use eminent domain several times in the past, mostly to displace people of color and working class communities and build new luxury facilities or parks or something like Lincoln Center. But they could also use that power for good, right? And we've seen this work in at least a couple of places. But they also own a lot of property, right? The city of New York, for instance, owns lots and land and buildings throughout the city, and oftentimes decides to sell that land or dispose of that land. So public land disposition is one key way that CLTs can get land. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Second is to intervene in private or tax debt or prevent foreclosures. So in many cases, when a building owner or a homeowner is in debt and either about to experience foreclosure or is perhaps in-rem foreclosure is going to be acted on by the city, a CLT could be a model to intervene to help keep people in their homes or help to restructure a building to become democratically governed. So there are examples of this for example, in Minnesota. They've used this really well to integrate single-family homes that are experiencing tax debt or foreclosure to come onto a CLT that allows them then to keep people in their homes. So you continue to live in the home and you continue to own the house while the CLT now owns the land and stewards it for the future. So debt intervention is one way to do it. Third way is to buy property, right, outright. And this is often a challenge if your CLT is new or it's very grassroots. You might not have the resources for this, but there are ways to strengthen it. One way is through legislation like opportunity to purchase bills. So I will talk about that a little bit later. But there are CLTs that just purchase properties on the market. And then the fourth way is, again, push for eminent domain. So I mentioned eminent domain earlier, but eminent domain in and of itself is an important tool that CLTs can use to transfer land from private ownership to government back to private ownership through the CLT. So those are general ways that CLTs have acquired land. In terms of financing, and this could be a whole conversation on its own, so I won't get too into details here, but there are a lot of ways that CLTs are exploring or have used to reach their affordability goals, acquire properties, rehab those properties, and make sure they remain affordable. This includes utilizing things like federal subsidies and tax credits, utilizing state and local housing subsidies, as well as private and public loans, right? So they often work with community development financial institutions or credit unions, or philanthropic entities that do loans, as well as private financing. Private fundraising. So there are a lot of foundations and grant-making institutions that are recognizing CLTs as being an important tool in fighting displacement and creating affordable housing and other needs. So there is more and more interest from the philanthropic sector to invest in CLTs. Just one note on the subsidy point here is that CLTs should be, and this is something we've been arguing for, should be a really appealing tool for state, local, and federal subsidies, because the purpose of a community land trust is to steward land forever in perpetuity for the purpose of affordable housing and other needs for the community. So now when local governments or state governments invest subsidies in affordable housing, as you may know, many of them have expiration dates, right? It could be a 15-year or 30-year timeline, but ultimately there's a planned exit from that subsidy where the units may then go to market rate, right? So ultimately what happens is the government invests subsidies for affordable housing. It stays affordable for a while. Eventually it becomes market rate. And then the government lost that subsidy. It's just lost to the market. Then they have to re-up that subsidy and do it again. You see this a lot with down payment assistance, right? Down payment assistance helps folks become homeowners, but once they become homeowners with that assistance and they meet the terms and they sell their home, that subsidy is lost, right? It's gone. The benefit of CLTs is that you invest that subsidy, and because it's for the purpose of permanent affordability, that subsidy will stay with that land forever. So the idea that you need to continuously pump more subsidy just to maintain the same levels of affordability is gone. Now you can focus on expanding the stock of affordable housing through new subsidies. So it should be a really appealing idea, and this is something that we're continuously advocating for state and local governments to start seeing the benefit of CLTs for what it can do for our budget. So talking a little bit more about what do CLTs look like around the country and here in New York. It's a growing landscape. It's a growing movement. Nationally, there are over 200 CLTs. That's probably an undercount because it's hard to get a full head count of CLTs in the country, but we know of at least 200. And on those 200 CLTs, they are stewarding about 35,000 homes, that's a small segment of the 250,000 shared equity homes in the country, right? So when we think about CLTs, it's part of a bigger landscape of shared equity homes, right? So it's a much bigger pot, but CLTs in particular are a growing part of that movement. CLTs are found in extremely diverse communities. Most prominently these days, you find them in urban areas that are experiencing gentrification, and you'll find that in places like Seattle and Los Angeles and Oakland, as well as here in New York. And lastly, CLTs are supporting a bigger cooperative movement in various aspects of our lives and economy. So a perfect example of this is Cooperative Jackson in Mississippi, where you see community land trusts working hand in hand with worker co-ops, right, to support democratically owned institutions of work and land stewardship and homes. So here in New York, we're also working towards that. We're working closely with our worker co-op partners who are advancing democratically owned workplaces, and we're trying to find ways to support worker co-ops on community land trusts and build out a more cooperative economy across the board. So just some examples that we want to share, and we're we can't get too detailed about any one specific one, but we're happy to share more information. If you're interested, you can always follow up with me. But probably the most prominent example in the country that a lot of folks think of when they think of CLTs is Dudley Street in Boston. So here's a neighborhood that was disinvested, a Black neighborhood that for a long time experienced high levels of disinvestment, redlining, falling property values, properties that were poorly managed as a result. And the folks at Dudley Street were able to actually work with the city to use its power of eminent domain to get land to the community land trust. And as a result, they've been able to build out a remarkable land trust that incorporates everything from housing to small businesses to local community gardens, which you can see here in the pictures. And it's probably one of the few examples where a city has willingly went along with the eminent domain route to get a community land trust land. So we hold it up as a really important example of what is possible if cities and local governments were bought into the idea of using CLTs to support communities. So when I get into the policy and advocacy side, definitely want to recall that. Another example of a CLT that's doing amazing work is out in Oakland, California, the Oakland CLT. Their model is more focused on these kind of single family homes, which are very common in Oakland, and identifying abandoned, often called zombie homes, and revitalizing them, putting them on the CLT and making them available for low-income individuals in the neighborhood, and specifically for single mothers experiencing homelessness. You may have heard of Oakland CLT recently. They've been in the news because they were connected to this group called Moms for Housing, which was a group of activist women, homeless mothers in particular, who had identified a number of houses that had been bought by real estate investors, many of whom are not from the area at all. They're private equity firms or things along those lines that were buying up single family homes as investments, and as a result they remained vacant. So while these single mothers were experiencing homelessness and sleeping on the streets, they were empty houses that were seen as tradable commodities by Wall Street. So what these women did was they occupied these homes. Some of the investors tried to get them removed and they resisted. And as a result, the city of Oakland worked with the community land trust to get those properties transferred to the CLT. And as a result, they're actually working with the women in this group to rehome them into some of these CLT properties. So it's a great example of how organizing and advocacy and action combined with the CLT model can really change people's lives and improve the neighborhood. And then I want to bring it to New York. Oh, sorry.
Can I ask you a quick question before we move on? Could you define shared equity housing for us, and just so we know what that is?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, so shared equity housing is referring to housing where individuals are shareholders, and they, as a member or as a shareholder, you have the opportunity to build equity, but the equity is capped, right? So in a full equity situation, right, if you're a homeowner or you live in a co-op where you own shares, you buy that home, and when you sell for whatever you can fetch for the home, right? Whatever the market is offering. So in kind of if you think about a house in Queens, for instance, maybe 20 years ago was selling for 200,000. Today it's selling for 700,000. That $500,000 equity is yours. You take it with you, right? Shared equity housing is a model where that equity is capped, right? So that the home remains used for affordable housing. So you might have bought it for 200,000, and when you sell, even though maybe in the neighborhood they're selling for 700,000, you have a covenant or agreement with the co-op or with the community land trust that you'll only sell it for maybe 300,000 or whatever inflation plus a little bit of equity would support. So usually there's something called a resale formula, which will determine how much you sell it for. And in most cases, you might sell it back directly to the community land trust or to the co-op, and then they'll sell it to the next family at a rate that remains affordable and accessible for them. So it's it's a different approach to housing than what a lot of people in the country might be used to, but it's a way to make sure that housing stays affordable and at the same time allows folks to build a little bit of equity in the process, if that makes sense. Cool.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So wanted to move over to New York City and again, highlight the coalition that New Economy Project is a part of. We're a member of the New York City Community Land Initiative, or NYCCLI. I know it's a little bit of a stretch. That's how we pronounce it. And NYCCLI is a citywide coalition that fights to preserve the rights of low-income people to live here in the city by supporting CLTs and other community-led housing and neighborhood development. Our members, again, are coming from all 5 boroughs and have various different visions for what they want in their neighborhood and how they want to get it. And all of them are using CLTs as a tool to help achieve those visions. So I'll give you some examples of some of the groups that are members. First one I want to highlight is East Harlem El Barrio CLT. This is a community land trust in East Harlem that formed very much out of NYCCLI's organizing. So we as a coalition had been advocating that the city, identify city-owned properties that could turn over to a community land trust. And we were able to convince the city to do this. So East Harlem El Barrio CLT recently acquired 4 properties in East Harlem that were city-owned, right? So they were being managed poorly, I might add, by the city. And you can see some of them here in the pictures. And East Harlem El Barrio CLT also acquired, of those 4, 2 of them were vacant buildings that they have been rehabilitating. And you can see these pictures at the bottom are examples of newly renovated units that they've worked on. So they've actually been able to, to acquire these properties. They're in the process of rehabbing them. And more importantly, they're in the process of training the residents who had been living there and had been living under the mismanagement of HPD and the city, and are starting to train them to become leaders in the Mutual Housing Association that will sit on top of the CLT, as well as leaders in the Community Land Trust itself. So it's a great example of what CLTs are capable of in terms of training and building up the leadership of residents that have been living as renters, as tenants for a long time, and have haven't had an avenue or a forum to directly govern what happens in their buildings or in their community, and now they're finding this outlet through the Community Land Trust and becoming part of the governing body. So East Harlem El Barrio CLT this year should be completing its renovation of those 2 buildings. So we're hopefully going to be celebrating that in May. And hopefully from then on, we'll see more growth and expansion throughout East Harlem. The second example I want to highlight is Cooper Square CLT, which is closer to your neighborhoods in Lower Manhattan. Cooper Square CLT is probably the largest community land trust. It is the largest community land trust in New York City. It was established in 1993 out of grassroots resistance to displacement. It currently stewards 21 buildings that have over 300 residential units. And these residential units are deeply affordable, right? So housing is provided at at rates that support like 25 to 35% of the area median income. So typically when the city does affordable housing, its target is 80% of area median income, or sometimes even higher than that. So this is an example of how CLTs can really support lower income folks to stay in the neighborhood. And in addition to those residential apartments, they also have 22 storefronts that are supporting local businesses, most of which are owned by women and people of color. In 2019, they expanded and they added 2 new buildings with 36 rent stabilized units. And they're in the process of forming a mutual housing association there that will help govern those 2 buildings. And that's an example of how a CLT, right, the Community Land Trust, will own the land. It would be a different entity governing those buildings inside the buildings. And that entity will be different from the co-op that governs the other buildings, the other 21 buildings. So it shows the flexibility of the Community Land Trust model to support different entities and different arrangements, rentals, limited equity, co-ops, and commercial properties, commercial storefronts. And they're in the process now of building out the leadership of those 2 new buildings so that they can join as members of the CLT governing board, as well as lead their mutual housing association. Going to some of the other boroughs, I want to highlight another example of a community land trust that's working on something outside of the housing realm right now. So Western Queens Community Land Trust in Long Island City and that surrounding area has been doing amazing work. They're a grassroots group of local residents that have organized, and their story actually grows out of the fight against the Amazon HQ2 plan. So they were members of the coalition that were fighting against Amazon coming to Long Island City. And part of that plan was that Amazon would be given this building that you see here, which is currently owned by the Department of Education. So it's a city-owned property. And they were going to be given this building as part of their HQ2, their headquarters. So after Amazon was defeated and HQ2 plans fell apart, this group formed as Western Queens Community Land Trust with the explicit goal of getting some of that land that was promised to Amazon to be given to the land trust so that they can make sure that the use of that land remained accessible and inclusive for the residents of that community, which includes the Queensbridge houses, which is the largest, the largest public housing project in the country. So the group has made tremendous progress. They've been able to get a grant and hire an architect that did a feasibility study of the building. And they put together this really great report that they're about to release that shows all the different uses that were developed by bringing community members together and envisioning what could be developed on this land. And they created a plan, a very detailed plan that would support everything from a rooftop garden to a shared kitchen and garage for street vendors to be able to go and prepare their food and then go out into the neighborhoods to sell. And they're envisioning a synergistic relationship, right, where some of the food that's produced on the rooftop can go to the kitchen and help the street vendors. And then, they also envision part of this space that's zoned for manufacturing could be used for light manufacturing jobs, could support artist studios and recording studios and things of that nature, as well as create childcare facilities at the top floor. So they've done an amazingly detailed plan, and all of that came directly from grassroots community organizing. Going to Brooklyn, we have the East New York Community Land Trust, which is another group that's done tremendous work, grassroots organizing. They have identified a number of problems in the East New York area, in East New York and Brownsville, particularly identified a number of vacant lots that are either publicly owned or privately owned as investment properties or would-be investment properties by speculators. And they've started to do grassroots community visioning of what folks in the neighborhood want to see built on those lots. They've been the leaders on the abolish the tax lien sale movement, to get rid of the tax lien sale that the city does right now, where it sells liens to a private trust that's essentially a Wall Street backed trust that then sells those liens to private debt collectors, and often leads to low-income people of color losing their homes or spiraling into deeper and deeper debt. So they've been leading that effort and envisioning how CLTs can help keep people in their homes, like we mentioned earlier, in terms of folks who might be experiencing foreclosure. And yeah, they've been doing tremendous work in identifying other uses for those vacant lands. They're partnering with Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation to start bringing properties onto their land trust. So they're in a slightly earlier stage than groups like Cooper Square CLP or East Harlem Barrio, but they are a tremendous force that if you haven't heard of them yet, I'm sure you will, and hopefully get a chance to experience some of their organizing. So all of that, just want to highlight that this is all kind of the exciting work that's happening on the ground in the neighborhoods, but on top of that, we're constantly trying to expand this movement. We want to do education and outreach to new communities, to new neighborhoods, because everyone's identifying the same problems, right? That land isn't affordable, their neighborhood's getting taken over by investors and speculators, their businesses are disappearing, cultural institutions are disappearing. So we're trying to make sure we do our part to reach out to communities and do this kind of education so that folks know that the CLT is a tool that can be used to help fight against some of these displacement pressures. So you can see here, this is just some examples of things that we do. We like to go out to neighborhoods when we're able to do them in person. We like to do them in person. Sometimes we do them like this virtually. We do have, as you can see in this picture over here, we have a board game called Trustville that actually teaches you how community land trusts work and gives you different scenarios that a CLT board might have to deal with, and teaches us how to work cooperatively to steward land and deal with some of the challenges CLTs deal with. It's really fun. So if there's ever a chance that we can get together, in the village and play Trustville, I'd love to bring a copy with me and do that with you guys. So yeah, we're always looking for new opportunities. So if you are part of another group, a church or a congregation or a local tenant association or whatever it might be, we're always happy to connect and do more workshops with you. The other thing I want to highlight that came out of this Nicely work is that we actually now have funding to support our organizing. So in the spring of 2019, we successfully convinced City Council to launch a citywide CLT initiative that provides funding for all these groups that I've been highlighting to do their organizing work, to go out to their communities and talk about CLTs and start doing community planning and visioning, and then to start, doing what they have to do to acquire that land and build affordable housing, commercial space, community space, green space, et cetera. So this has been a really important tool that's helped us make progress. And we're hoping this year to continue getting funded by a council so that we can continue doing this organizing work. And just to give you an idea of who's been part of that, this is a map of all the CLTs that have been organizing around the city. As you can see, it's a true 5-borough movement, even Staten Island, which is often left out, but we got a group out there doing it across Queens and Brooklyn, the Bronx, as well as Manhattan. And we have 4 organizations that you can see at the top left-hand corner that are providing technical assistance and supporting groups on the ground, including New Economy Project. And then I promised I would talk about policy. I'm not going to talk too much because I know we're running short on time, but I did want to just mention a few of the policies that we're fighting for that will make CLTs more viable and successful and grow. Because, you know, we ultimately what happens in our neighborhood is a policy decision, right? The city is deciding every day who gets subsidized, who gets land, who gets access to financing, et cetera. So just 4 things to highlight. I already talked about the funding piece, so let me talk about that real quick. So funding for CLTs and deep affordability. We're constantly fighting at the city and state level to fund community land trusts. We think with the state budget, we're going to get some funding that will support CLT acquisition of land, as well as perhaps some rehab and new construction. So that's going to be really critical because if we don't have access to funding, it's really challenging to make any of this work. So again, it's a policy decision. We can fund, you know, the things we prioritize, and if we prioritize community control of neighborhoods and democratic governance and stewardship of land, we can get it. So we're excited for what the budget might reveal this year. Back up to the top, you see this public land for public good. That's a key policy that we're fighting for. The city still owns tons of land, many of it vacant, many of it with buildings that sit partially occupied sometimes. And the city has plans to dispose of that land. We are fighting to actually change the charter in the city that would require the city to give preference to community land trusts or other nonprofit entities that are committed to permanent affordability, and give them essentially the first crack at applying for to an RFP to acquire that property. So obviously not every parcel of land will become a community land trust or part of a community land trust, but we think if there's a CLT organizing in the neighborhood and they're fighting for land, they should have, you know, essentially first dibs on acquiring those properties when the city decides that they're going to get rid of that that public land. The second thing just underneath it, opportunity to purchase. I mentioned this earlier. We're fighting for bills at the city level and the state level that will make it easier for community land trusts to purchase properties. So the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, which is at the city level, works hand in hand with the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act at the state level. And essentially what those bills do is it would give CLTs or tenant associations the first right to make an offer when a building owner, when a landlord decides to sell their building. So the tenants as a tenant association or CLT as an entity will have the right to make that first offer. And then they'll have the right to match other offers that are made on the market. So this is, we think, a really important tool. It's used in other cities. San Francisco introduced a COPA bill recently. Washington, D.C. has had a TOPA bill for a long time with, you know, it's had its issues, but, you know, we've learned from what's worked and what hasn't worked in Washington, D.C. We think it would be a tremendous boost to the community land trust movement in New York. And ultimately, building owners would still be able to get their asking price, right? There's nothing limiting what they can sell, and no one says that they have to sell to the community land trust. They can get another offer. If the CLT can't match it, they can't match it, but it gives us a foot in the door, which is really critical as someone who's worked for a neighborhood-based organization that's acquired properties. I can tell you that it's often just knowing, you know, what the other group is offering could give you tremendous leverage in being able to buy a building. And then the last thing, as I mentioned earlier, we're fighting to abolish and replace New York City's tax lien sale. We want a more equitable system for municipal debt collection that will use CLTs as a possible off-ramp for homeowners or building owners that are unable to meet their tax obligations, and find a way to put more properties onto community land trusts, keep people in their homes, and expand the stock of affordable housing in New York City. So those are our policies that we're fighting for. You can learn more about them on our website, and happy to talk more in depth about any of them. And that's it. This is my email address. If you want to follow up with some specific questions, feel free to do so, or you can check out NYCLI's website if you want to join the coalition. And that's it. Almost kept it on time. So happy to answer any questions.
Well, that was so exciting and wonderful. And I think in times like these, which we've been saying for like years now, but in times like these, I think something like this is very inspiring and gives us kind of a blueprint for the possibilities of what could come forward. We do have a few questions, and if you have more questions, feel free to type them in. I would also say you're all going to get a survey, so let us know if you'd like a 201 that we could do in person. And also, if you're watching this video on YouTube, email me, Leanne at Village Preservation, and let us know if you'd be interested, because I think that'd be great now that we're starting to go back in person. Well, so first question, can community land trusts be used for public space? And I think you kind of spoke to this, but could you expand a little bit about public space rather than housing or private homes?
Yeah, for sure. I think, you know, a good example of like public space, I think that often comes to mind for us is something like a park, right? A public park. And certainly, you know, I think for many situations when it comes to green space, when it comes to accessible space, we want the city to do its part and to, you know, build more parks, particularly in Black, brown, immigrant neighborhoods that often lack them. So we've seen that, you know, the city isn't always living up to that, you know. So we've seen that the Community Land Trust has been a tool that could be used to steward land in those neighborhoods that that lack that kind of public green space. So key example of this is in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, there's a group called the Mont Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards, and they're actually working, they put together a comprehensive waterfront plan for their neighborhood, which is right on the waterfronts, the southern tip of the Bronx, and are actively stewarding land even before having ownership of it. And they've actually convinced the city to adopt their plan, because, you know, it was community led, it was, you know, directly responding to the needs of that neighborhood. And, you know, they jumped out ahead and said, if city's not doing it, we're going to do it. And then we're going to make sure the city follows our plan. So that's, I think, an example of how CLTs can be used for public space. But more broadly, you know, CLTs can definitely make space available, right, to the wider neighborhood. And I think that's something they want to do. CLTs, we have a group in the Bronx that's also working on preserving community gardens, right? Many of these community gardens were built in lots that were abandoned and disinvested in. So they're actively working to make sure that those community gardens stay open and accessible to the community, to the neighborhood. So again, that's another way I think that CLTs can expand our public space.
That's a great lead into another question. The first question we got was, can a community garden become a CLT? Or could you speak a little bit about if there's any examples?
Yeah, exactly. So definitely, and I always like to go back to the origins of the CLT, as you know, the model was developed by New Communities Inc. in Albany, Georgia, as a civil rights part of the civil rights movement, to make sure that Black farmers had access to good farmable land. And I think that you know, that aspect of the CLT lives on today in urban areas as well, where, you know, a lot of CLTs are organizing around community gardens, because, you know, that was once land that was seen as, you know, lacking any value to a speculator or investor. And now all of a sudden has all this development potential. So there are so many speculators that would love to take over those gardens, you know, clean them out and build condos. But a lot of the CLTs that we're working with want to make sure, you know, it might be the only place that neighbors can do gardening and grow produce. And in many cases, there's a group in the Bronx, the Mary Mitchell Center, that's organizing a CLT around community gardens, and they recognize that for a lot of the kids in the neighborhood, this is the only opportunity they have to like touch soil and watch something grow. So they see it as a critical part of their learning experience as kids, and want to make sure that those gardens stay accessible to the community. So absolutely, community gardens are I think an essential part of the CLT movement.
And speaking of kids and gardens and communities, someone made a comment, but I would love to know if you know any examples of CLTs working with freedom schools or kind of educational spaces and community land trusts.
Yeah, I definitely know that there's something out of state. I'm just kind of blanking on which, could be in DC or something, where there
I totally put you on the spot.
Yeah, so that's cool. But there is definitely a CLT, and I'll have to follow up, that has a school on its facilities. So it owns the land and it leases the land to the school. And I also know that, there's been talks with the Western Queens Community Land Trust in recognizing that the Department of Education building is a DOE building, that they would love to find a way to support a school, right? So in that diagram you saw, part of it was childcare. So I think there was recognition that there could be, a school integrated into that. The space is tremendous. It's a huge building. The picture doesn't do justice to how big of a space it is, and the DOE currently is only using like a quarter of it. So so I think there's definitely an opportunity. Like I said, CLTs are remarkably flexible, and they can support pretty much anything that you think your neighborhood needs can be supported by a CLT.
That's amazing. And someone asked specifically, the DOE building on Vernon and 44th is still city owned and not yet a CLT. Could you speak to that a little?
Yeah, that's right. So it's still owned by the DOE. The Western Queens Community Land Trust has identified that as its primary target for the land trust. They've also been looking at other properties, right? And they want to be holistic in the neighborhood and not, just short-sighted about this one property, but they recognize the tremendous potential that you saw in that diagram. So they've been actively building up the case and talking to the city about potentially acquiring it. So part of what they did with this report was put together this really detailed architectural plan with an architect, right, that they were able to hire with a grant that they got to, in part convince the city, like, here's a great opportunity. You don't have to do this, right, yourself. Give it over to us. We'll do it. We have, the volunteers. We have, the network. We have groups like New Economy Project, like others that are willing to, put in the work to help make this a reality, and hopefully the city will work with them. We've had support from city council members in the area. The Queensboro president is supportive of this idea and has arranged a walking tour of the facilities for the CLT. So yeah, we're not there yet, but it's all about the long fight, and hopefully we'll be able to win. Many of us in Queens, thought that stopping Amazon was going to be impossible, right? But it wasn't. So the impossible is possible sometimes.
Definitely. And I that building, I think there's a dance studio there that my first auditions as a choreographer, one of my first auditions were held there. So I have a soft spot for that spot. And then someone asked, do you get pushback because land and CLTs are withdrawn from the tax rolls?
Yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing, balance, I think, about figuring it out. We know that if, all land was put onto a CLT and, don't have any tax base, like, obviously that might be an issue. And yeah, so that's something we've talked about. Often what we're seeing with, the strategy that we talked about in terms of using tax delinquent properties or tax lien sale intervention, we're seeing that a lot of folks are unable to maintain paying their taxes anyway. So these properties aren't necessarily generating tax revenue for the city anyway. So the way we envision it would be that yeah, the CLT would acquire the land and it would be tax exempt. But it doesn't mean that the house on top of it is tax exempt, right? So property in that sense, we'd have to just kind of change the assessment process so that there are still taxes collected on the house and on the improvements or on the multifamily building or what have you. But yeah, the land itself, because we would be a nonprofit entity owning it, would be exempt.
And as we know, or as I know, and many people probably know, there are many tax subsidies that go to for-profit institutions that take them off the tax roll. So I don't have the data on that, but I'm sure there's a report somewhere that compares what would be, lost for the community land trust versus what is already lost, which is a big part of that Amazon site. And then, so any other questions, feel free to get them in. And Will, if you could speak a little bit more, if you have any more information about the Cooper Square Community Land Trust, I think that would be a great way to kind of end in our community. Maybe we're all spread apart, but virtually in our community.
Yeah, again, the Cooper Square Community Land Trust is kind of like our shining example of a CLT in an urban center. It was built out of a much longer fight, going back to like Robert Moses plans and everything to preserve the neighborhood. And ultimately, the city ended up giving land to the Cooper Square Mutual Housing Association, and then that Mutual Housing Association arranged a deal with a community land trust, the Cooper Square Community Land Trust, to transition the land to the CLT. All the buildings remain owned by the Mutual Housing Association, so that the CLT would steward the land, in perpetuity. And yeah, like I said, they've been doing tremendous work in maintaining deeply affordable housing. They have, I think, when they formed, as a co-op, they offered shares at something like $300, to become a shareholder. So talking about very affordable, and they're a shared equity housing model, right? So you don't build a lot of wealth, in other like Mitchell-Lamba buildings and many other models of limited equity. You have examples where people bought very deeply subsidized homes or apartments, and then they go market rate, and you get this tremendous windfall, right? And that tremendous windfall just goes to that one family, and then it's lost. So shared equity prevents that from happening. But yeah, like I said, they've been able to support deeply affordable housing, in part because they're able to cross-subsidize some of the costs from the businesses there. So they do rent their storefronts to local businesses for what we would consider to be reasonably affordable rents, particularly for Manhattan. But their mission isn't explicit to provide subsidized rents to the businesses. So they are, maybe closer to market rate, but they're certainly below market rate, right? They're below what you would find elsewhere. So being able to rent out those storefronts for a little bit more, revenue than it costs to operate, they're then able to take some of that revenue and invest it back into the building to maintain deeper affordability. So they're doing great work. I'm happy to connect the Cooper Square folks to anyone, if you want to learn more and find out more about the work that they're doing. They're nice people. So.
That's good to hear. Our neighbors, we're right down the street on 11th is our offices. So I walk by that
great.
area all the time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Will. Thank you so much. I'm always inspired after I hear you speak. And so thank you for that, for all of us. Thank you all for coming today. And I always say this is kind of like our Take the Medicine kind of workshops where we need to learn these tools so we can really make a change. So thank you for joining us to learn that. And yeah, I think we'll be in person very soon, Will. So maybe we can come back and do some fun games and workshops on site downtown.
That would be great. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Well, would you like any last words before we go, Will?
No, just thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. And please feel free to reach out if there are any other questions, and check out the NYCCLI website. There are tons of articles and things that you can read more about CLTs on that website.
Yeah, we'll be sure to include it in our follow-up email. And any other resources you'd like to share, well, feel free to send those my way and we can send them. And we have a very abrupt, when I hit end, we all go away. So have a great evening, everyone, and take care. Thanks so much.